So let's talk about the Minister of Finance today, who holds the final stakeholders engagement forum ahead of November 16th final deadline to wrap up the Finance Bill 2020, which will be presented to the National Assembly as part of the Budget 2021 laid before the lawmakers last month by Mr. President. And let's get a sense of this with Wole Olugbenro, or Yomi Olugbenro, who is a partner and West Africa tax leader at Deloitte, Nigeria. He joins me now to discuss the making of the Finance Bill 2020. What does it mean for the economy? Good evening, Yomi. It's good to have you at very short notice. Thank you very much. Tell us about this, some of the economic and fiscal policy drivers that underpin the new Fiscal Bill 2020.
Right. Thank you, Bosin. Good to be on your show. Maybe if we take a quick step back, you'll recall that in 2019, we saw the return of the use of this finance bill, accompanying the appropriation bill, to the National Assembly. And that law was passed earlier in this year. So the promise then was that this will remain as an annual exercise so that on a continuous basis, we can make some little tweaks here and there in our tax legislations in response to whatever is the emerging reality that we need to deal with. So this week, we've had the Minister of Finance, exposed to the general public what you can call, the latest version of a bill that will eventually be submitted. So we must mention that as we speak now, the bill is not yet submitted to the National Assembly, so it's the initial stakeholder engagement and trying to seek input from a taxpayer and everyone so that we can all participate in the process. It will still be approved by FEC and before it's submitted to the National Assembly.
There are 5 pillars, or what you call the thematic areas of this fiscal bill, and I'm sure you've gone through them. Are they strategic enough to support the economic recovery drive that the government is pursuing?
Well, so let's look at the five thematic area, like you said. So one is around making some amendment to the tax law and the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So the number of provisions in the law that are probably overlapping or ambiguous or that needs to be introduced so that we can institutionalize certain reforms. So that's one thematic area. There is the other thematic area around ease of doing business. You recall that we've made some bit of progress. We've made some gains with the initiative of the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council that is leading the Ease of Doing Business initiative. But many of these reform needs to be institutionalized so that they can become permanent and the gains can be long-lasting. So that's another part of it. There is also the area that is dealing with the disaster management and response to COVID-19. So there are initiatives around setting up a crisis intervention fund so that we can have pool of funds available to the government to be able to deal with cases of natural disaster such as COVID-19 that we have. Also on procurement processes, there are a number of changes that have been proposed in those areas and fiscal reform. So those are the thematic areas. The truth is that one single finance bill may not, eliminate all of the challenges and all of the troubles that we may have in our tax law, but they're a very critical element to making sure that at every point in time, we are able to make quick fixes and quick responses. So, for example, even as recent as the law that was signed this year, there are a number of, ambiguities, overlaps that the law had, we have identified in the course of implementation, that needed to be set straight. There are some changes that were made, for example, that in the current crisis of COVID-19, the government deemed it appropriate to be able to maybe relax the rule a little, and I can give a quick example of that. In the Finance Act 2019, we made changes to the minimum tax rule, which set it at 0.5% of turnover for businesses. If you look at the impact of that on many businesses that are likely going to be reporting losses for 2020, for example, government says, look, we can proposed halving that, reducing that provision for minimum tax into, by 50%, for example, and that will be applicable for this year and for next year. So we must recognize that this is not the, this is a finance bill, right? It's not the economic recovery law. So it will be part of the critical element that we need to be able to provide palliative, ensure that we respond to some of the changes that we're seeing on the fiscal space.
So when we look at the last, the first fiscal bill which we had for last year and this year, do you think we're now on the trajectory of a fiscal bills trajectory that will keep helping us moving forward even beyond the few years coming?
That's correct. So if you look at the bill that was signed this year, the last year's bill, it focuses essentially on about 4 key areas. One is provide incentive to SMEs and introduce some ease of doing business initiatives. The second was to raise revenue for government. The third, government identified that there are a number of provisions in our tax law that have become archaic, and disincentive to business. Some of those were changed, and generally just to align our tax law to global best practices. And I must say that some of the changes that we made earlier in the year actually came very handy in responding to the crisis, for example. The micro and small businesses tax incentive that were introduced, you realize that if those were not in place, it will be part of the cry, that we will be making now to say, look, you need to incentivize micro and small businesses, you need to provide some tax palliatives to them. But because that came in, at the beginning of the year, it was like we were one step ahead in responding to that.
In summary, we got it right with the fiscal bill of 2019. We were just ahead of the curve. So we hope the 2020 will take us again ahead of the curve. Thank you so much, Wole Olugbenro. Enjoy the rest of your evening. It's a Friday. Thank you so much. And the vehicular traffic out there is something very, very, very tough.